What happened in that small hospital room in Phoenix would forever change the world-famous violinist André Rieu, but it started with just 3 simple words from a 12-year-old boy that no one saw coming. André had walked into Children's Hospital of Phoenix, expecting a routine 5-minute visit, the kind he'd done hundreds of times before. But when young Kieran looked him straight in the eyes and asked a question that had nothing to do with music, everything changed. The answer André gave didn't just transform that moment, it sent shockwaves through everyone present and would reshape how he approached every performance for the rest of his career. But what the boy asked next left André completely speechless, and what happened in the following 24 hours would become the most important performance of his entire life. Before we continue with this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and how old you are. Drop your city and age in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button because stories like this one will inspire and move you in ways you never expected. André Rieu's visit to Children's Hospital of Phoenix wasn't connected to any concert or part of his public schedule. It was a brief stop, quietly arranged by his management team without press coverage and without expectation of any major response. For the hospital, his presence held simple value, offering a few minutes of attention to children who spent entire days between tests, treatments, and waiting. For André, it was simply one of those visits he regularly made away from the stages, where there was no music, no applause, and no defined scripts. The hospital was located in a quiet area far from downtown Phoenix and followed its usual afternoon rhythm. Staff circulated through the hallways, parents spoke in soft voices, and the children filled time however they could. Some drew pictures, others watched television, and still others simply observed the movement around them. When André entered, accompanied by a staff member, there was no immediate commotion. Some recognized his face, others didn't. He wore simple clothing and walked slowly, listening more than speaking. Before reaching Kieran's room, André passed through other wings. He greeted children, answered brief questions, and heard quick stories about pain, improvements, and homesickness. At no point did he speak about music. There, his name wasn't the most important thing. The environment didn't allow for pretense or empty words. Everything there was too concrete for that. The room where Kieran was located sat at the end of the hallway. His mother, Sage, sat beside the bed. The doctor had just left, and a nurse was adjusting some equipment before withdrawing. Kieran seemed alert, observing every detail without showing fear of the visitor's presence. André approached carefully, expecting only another brief conversation, like so many others that day, without suspecting he would leave carrying a question that couldn't be ignored. The silence in the hallway was heavy with expectation. André had no idea that what would follow would not only change his day, but the way he looked at his own life. Kieran in that room carried a question that had waited years to be asked of the right person, and André was about to become that person, ready or not. The late afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the hospital walls. Outside, life continued its normal pace. People hurried home, cars drove past. But inside those rooms, time was different, slower, heavier, more meaningful. André had never thought that a routine hospital visit would become one of the most important moments of his life. He was accustomed to grand concert halls and thousands of people applauding, emotions orchestrated by music. But what awaited him in that small room was something no amount of music could have prepared him for. The nurse who guided them stopped at the door and gestured for André to enter. He nodded and stepped across the threshold, not knowing he was entering a space where honesty was the only currency that mattered, where a child waited with a question that went straight to the heart. André stepped into the room with the same demeanor he'd maintained since the beginning of the visit, calm, unhurried, and without expectations. He knew that in that environment, every exaggerated gesture drew the wrong kind of attention. He approached the bed slowly, greeted Sage with a discreet gesture, and directed his gaze to Kieran, who continued observing in silence. There was no excessive curiosity or enthusiasm about the presence of someone famous. Kieran seemed more interested in understanding who stood before him than in knowing what that person represented outside. Sage briefly explained her son's situation, speaking in soft tones, as if more accustomed to repeating that information than expecting any special reaction. André listened attentively, asked one or two simple questions, and thanked her. There wasn't much to say. The hospital imposed clear limits on any conversation. Some stories didn't need to be explored to be understood. Kieran was 14 years old enough to understand what was happening around him, but still carrying that direct manner of children who hadn't learned to sidestep difficult questions. He held a small notebook on his legs and scribbled something occasionally without showing it to anyone. André noticed the movement but didn't comment. He sat in a chair near the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. The conversation began in an ordinary way. Kieran asked where André came from, whether he traveled much and if he liked being home. André answered simply, without mentioning stages, orchestras, or audiences. He spoke about hotels, airports, and how even with all the travel, he still loved ordinary things like walking without destination or sitting in silence. Kieran listened attentively, as if evaluating each answer. Outside the room, the nurse observed from a distance. She had seen similar visits before. Normally they lasted a few minutes, ended with a photo or an encouraging phrase and moved on. Nothing indicated this one would be different. André believed that too. He was already mentally preparing to end the conversation when Kieran closed his notebook and raised his eyes directly. The question came without hesitation. There was no introduction or explanation. Kieran simply asked if André knew Jesus. The tone wasn't challenging or catechistic. It seemed more like a natural continuation of the conversation, as if that information was necessary for Kieran to organize what he was thinking. André didn't answer immediately. He understood the question the moment it was asked, but realized that any automatic response would sound false. It wasn't about saying yes or no. It was also not a question that could be sidestepped with humor or generalities. Sage remained motionless. The nurse still in the hallway noticed something had changed and stayed there without entering. While thinking, André remembered how many times he had spoken about emotion, spirituality, and meaning through music, without ever having to put those ideas into direct words. On stage, he'd always had his violin as an intermediary. Here, however, there was no instrument, only a clear question posed by someone not interested in speeches, but in truth. André looked at Kieran again, and noticed the boy showed no fear of the answer. He was just waiting. He seemed not to be testing André, but trusting that he would hear something honest. It was then that André understood this conversation was no longer just a protocol visit. Whatever answer he gave would stay with Kieran for a very long time, maybe years, maybe forever. Before speaking, André took a deep breath, aware he was about to say something that hadn't been rehearsed on any stage and couldn't be taken back later. He opened his mouth, but before the words came, something unexpected happened. The door opened, and another nurse entered with medications. The moment was interrupted. Kieran looked at the nurse, then back at André. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered, but not forgotten. André felt the pressure of that question like a physical weight. This wasn't something he could postpone or avoid. The child deserved a real answer. The nurse worked quickly and efficiently, checking vital signs and noting something on a clipboard. When finished, she nodded to Sage and left. Silence returned to the room, heavier now, charged with unspoken words. André leaned forward in his chair. He had made a decision. He wouldn't lie, wouldn't evade, wouldn't hide behind beautiful words. He would speak from his own experience, his own understanding, however incomplete it might be. But before he could begin, Kieran said something that completely surprised André. Kieran said he understood that some questions didn't have easy answers, and that it was okay if André needed time to think. That maturity, that understanding from a child so young, touched André deeper than the original question. It was then André realized this conversation wasn't about him teaching the child. It was about both of them trying to understand something together that was bigger than either of them, and that realization changed everything about how he would answer. The room suddenly felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because the intimacy of the moment made everything outside those four walls irrelevant. Larger because what was happening had consequences that reached further than André could see. He looked at Sage, who watched him with eyes that said she was also waiting, also hoping for words that made sense in a world that often seemed senseless. He looked at Kieran, whose face showed a mixture of curiosity and something resembling wise understanding. And then André began to speak, not with the certainty of someone who knows all the answers, but with the honesty of someone willing to share his own struggle. André took a few seconds before answering, not from lack of words, but because he needed to decide how honest to be, without being careless. He knew Kieran wasn't asking a theoretical question. That question came from a concrete place, probably from earlier conversations, from difficult nights, from attempts to understand what was happening to his own body. André had seen this before in other hospitals. Children didn't ask about faith out of intellectual curiosity. They asked because they needed some kind of foundation. When he finally spoke, André chose to begin with what he knew best. He said he had never been a person of ready-made answers, but that from a young age he had learned to hear something greater than himself through music. He explained that for him, knowing Jesus had never been about repeating words or following rules, but about recognizing moments when someone chooses to care for another person, even without obligation. He spoke slowly, without raising his voice, as if thinking along with Kieran while he spoke. Kieran listened without interrupting. He didn't nod or show approval or disagreement. He just followed. Sage remained seated beside the bed with folded hands, paying attention to every sentence. André noticed he wasn't just speaking to a child. That answer reached everyone who was there, including himself. He told about meeting many people throughout his life in concert halls, churches, hospitals, and backstage, and that in all those places he had seen the same kind of gesture, someone offering presents when another needed it most. He said that if he had to define what he understood by Jesus, it would be that, not a distant image, but something that manifests when someone doesn't turn their face away from another's pain. Kieran then made a simple observation, saying the nurse who cared for him always returned to the room at night, even when not called. He asked if that was also part of what André meant. André answered yes, that it was perhaps one of the clearest examples. The nurse still at the door heard the conversation without interfering. That observation didn't embarrass her, but didn't make her smile either. It was simply truth. The conversation continued at that pace, without rush. André spoke about moments in his own life when he had found no answers, only company. He told how often music had taken that place, not as a solution, but as something that helped get through what seemed impossible. He mentioned no major events or achievements, staying with small experiences that usually don't appear in interviews. Kieran asked if André believed someone could be present even when not seen. André answered that he believed so, but that he didn't know how to explain it. He said only that he had felt that many times, especially when playing for people who were suffering. It was as if something circulated between people without needing to be named. For him, that was also part of the answer. Sage took a deep breath and looked away for a moment. It wasn't displayed emotion, it was recognition. André noticed and understood this conversation was touching something that had long been carried in silence. Outside, movement in the hallway had decreased. The staff member who accompanied André waited patiently without interrupting. The visit time had already been exceeded, but no one seemed willing to end this moment. There was no administrative urgency greater than what was happening there. But then came the next turn. Kieran closed his notebook and looked directly at André with an intensity that didn't match his age. He asked if André had ever been afraid, really afraid, not of small things, but of something that made him doubt everything. The question came so directly that André leaned back in his chair. This was no longer childlike curiosity. This was a child trying to understand his own fears by seeing if an adult, someone who seemed successful, also knew those fears. André felt his throat tighten. He could lie, change the subject, say something reassuring. But Kieran's eyes left no room for lies. André thought back to moments in his career when he had doubted, when success felt like a mask that was too heavy to wear, when he wondered if everything he did really had meaning or was just noise. He had never spoken publicly about those moments. They didn't fit the image of the always smiling entertainer, but here in this room with this child looking at him with uncompromising honesty, André felt he couldn't escape. He nodded slowly. Yes, he had been afraid many times. Sometimes on stage, surrounded by thousands of people, he felt most alone. Sometimes after a perfect concert, he felt an emptiness that music couldn't fill. Kieran listened with a seriousness that was heartbreaking in a child. Then he asked something André didn't see coming. Did Jesus also ask if André knew him? Like Kieran was asking now. Was faith also a mutual question? The question hit André like a physical blow. He had never thought about faith that way, as something reciprocal, as a conversation instead of an answer. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, filled the room, became almost tangible. Sage looked at her son with a mixture of pride and concern. The nurse at the door stood motionless, realizing she was witnessing something extraordinary. And André sat there, a man accustomed to having answers, to leading orchestras and audiences, completely disarmed by a child's wisdom. Outside the room, hospital life continued. Feet walked through hallways, machines beeped, phones rang. But in that small space, everything had stopped, focused on this moment of raw honesty between a world-famous musician and a boy in a hospital bed. André realized what was happening wasn't just a conversation about faith. It was a confrontation with his own authenticity, with the question of whether he lived in accordance with what he claimed to believe. And that was much harder to face than he had ever thought. After the question, the room didn't immediately return to the normal rhythm of the hospital. There was no clear closure or feeling of completion. André remained seated for several moments, as if still organizing what had been said. Kieran also showed no hurry. The boy reopened his notebook and made a few strokes, but now with less distraction, as if he felt lighter. André noticed something strange. The answer he had given didn't feel complete, not because it was wrong, but because it had opened a door he hadn't expected. He looked at Kieran and saw the boy was now drawing something else, something that looked like a violin. Without looking up, Kieran said his father used to play guitar before becoming too ill to continue. The comment came casually, but carried weight. André stiffened. This wasn't just about faith anymore. This was about loss, about things being taken away, about dreams ending before completion. He asked carefully if Kieran's father was still alive. The boy nodded, but said he was now in another hospital, too far away to visit often. Sage shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. She wanted to say something but held back. André saw the tension in her face and understood this family carried more than just Kieran's illness. There was a whole network of pain, unspoken things, concerns that could never be fully shared. Kieran looked up from his drawing and asked if André thought music could heal people, not their bodies, but something else, something deeper. André felt the question like a trap, not because Kieran was trying to catch him, but because any answer would be inadequate. He had used music his entire life as an answer to questions like this. But now, faced with the reality of a child in a hospital bed, all that certainty felt hollow. He said honestly that he didn't know. He had seen people cry during concerts, had received letters from people saying his music helped them through difficult times. But he didn't know if that was healing or just a temporary pause from pain. He didn't know if music really changed anything or just gave the feeling that things were changeable. Kieran nodded, as if that was exactly the answer he expected. He said sometimes not knowing was more important than pretending to know. That comment, so simple yet so profound, touched André in a place he had forgotten to protect. Then, something happened that no one expected. The door opened and a man entered, clearly hurried with an exhausted but determined expression. It was Kieran's father, Dex. He had come despite his own health problems, despite the distance, because he couldn't wait another day to see his son. Sage jumped up, clearly shocked. They hadn't expected him to be able to come. The nurse moved quickly to help Dex to a chair, concerned about his condition, and Kieran, the child who had shown so much maturity, broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he reached for his father. André stood, realizing he was suddenly the intruder in an intimate family moment. He made motions to leave, but Dex grabbed his arm. The man looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, suffered too much, and said something André would never forget. "Thank you for taking the time to really listen to my son. Most people just pretend." That recognition from a stranger fighting his own battle touched André deeper than 1,000 standing ovations ever had. He nodded, unable to find words, and stepped back to give the family space. But before he could leave the room, Dex asked him something else. He asked if André would stay for a few more minutes because he wanted his son to hear something from someone other than his parents. André hesitated, looked at the nurse who nodded. It was okay, and sat back down. Dex began to speak, his voice weak but clear. He told about his own struggle with faith, about how he had cursed God when he became ill, how he had screamed at heaven for answers that never came. He told how he had slowly learned that faith wasn't about getting answers, but about learning to live with questions. He looked at his son and said the question Kieran had asked André, "Do you know Jesus?" was a question he asked himself every day. And every day the answer was different, depending on what that day brought, how much pain he felt, how much hope he could gather. André listened, captivated by this man's raw honesty. There was no theater here, no attempt to impress. This was a man laying bare his soul because he wanted his son to understand that doubt wasn't weakness, that asking questions didn't mean lack of faith. Sage cried quietly, her hand over her mouth. The nurse wiped her own eyes. And Kieran, the child who had started all this with a simple question, looked from his father to André with an expression that said he understood everything on a level words couldn't reach. Then came another twist. Dex asked André if he had brought his violin. André shook his head. This wasn't a planned performance. But the man persisted. He said he wanted his son to hear something beautiful, something that would remain after all words were forgotten. André felt trapped. He had no instrument, no preparation, no plan, but the hope in the man's eyes, the silent pleas in Sage's gaze, Kieran's expectant face, all pushed him toward a decision that made no rational sense but felt emotionally inevitable. He stood and said he would return the next day with his violin. He would play not for an audience, but for this family, in this room, without cameras or recordings. It would be a moment that belonged only to them, a gift without conditions. Dex closed his eyes and nodded, too exhausted to say more but clearly grateful. Kieran smiled, a real smile that lit up his entire face. And André left the room, knowing he had just made a promise that would cost him more than any concert, because it would require him to give himself completely without the protection of a stage. In the hallway stood the staff member who had guided him. She looked at him with an expression that said she understood what had just happened, how a simple question from a child had started a cascade of events no one could have predicted. André walked toward the exit, his thoughts racing, wondering what he had just committed himself to, and why it felt like the most important performance of his entire career. André left the hospital in a state he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't excitement or fear, but something in between, a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He had made a promise without thinking about consequences, driven by an impulse stronger than logic. As he walked to his car, he realized he had just agreed to play in a hospital room without an audience, without a stage, for a family he barely knew. That evening in his hotel in downtown Phoenix, André unpacked his violin from its case. He hadn't touched the instrument since his last concert days earlier. He ran his fingers over the smooth wood, felt the familiar shape, and tried to think what he would play. This couldn't be standard repertoire. None of the pieces he had performed thousands of times. This had to be something else, something that spoke to the situation this family faced. He thought back to the conversation with Kieran, the question about Jesus, the father's honesty, the mother's silent pain. What music could encompass all that? What melody could offer comfort without being false, hope without being naive? André tried different pieces, but each felt wrong, too theatrical, too virtuosic, too distant. He had built his entire career creating emotional experiences for large audiences, but now, faced with the intimacy of a single family, all his tricks felt empty. He stopped playing and sat in silence. The room around him was impersonal, a standard hotel room like thousands of others he had seen, but in that moment, it felt like a place of confrontation where he had to decide what his music really meant beyond applause and reviews. The next morning, André returned to Children's Hospital of Phoenix. This time he carried his violin case, a visible sign of his intentions. The staff member who received him seemed surprised, but said nothing. They guided him through the now familiar hallways to Kieran's room. When he entered, he saw the entire family was present. Kieran lay in bed, clearly tired but alert. Sage sat in her usual spot, and Dex, despite his weakness, had pulled a chair close. There was also a new presence, an older woman introduced as Kieran's grandmother, Willow. André greeted everyone and began preparing his violin. As he tuned the strings, he felt the family's eyes on him. There was no conversation, just expectation. He realized what he was about to do wasn't a performance. It was an act of witness, a way to be present with these people in their pain and hope. He decided to begin with a simple song, a melody his mother had taught him when he was a child. It wasn't a famous piece, no technical demonstration, but something he associated with comfort and home. As he played, he closed his eyes and let the music come without intellectual control, just feeling. The melody filled the small room, bouncing off the bare walls. It wasn't perfect, there were notes he would normally have corrected, phrases he would have refined. But here, in this moment, perfection was irrelevant. What mattered was connection, the way music created a bridge between his experience and theirs. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence. Then Willow began crying softly. She explained her own mother used to sing that song decades ago, in times that now seemed unreachable. André had no idea he would activate that specific memory, but understood music often worked in ways the musician couldn't predict. Dex asked if André knew another piece, something that spoke of struggle and victory. André thought and chose part of a Baroque composition he had associated with resilience. It was technically more challenging, but he played it with a focus that excluded everything outside the room. While playing, André noticed something remarkable. Kieran had fallen asleep, not from boredom, but from a kind of deep relaxation. His face, which had carried the tension of someone who had to bear too much for his age, was now peaceful. Sage noticed too, and smiled through her tears. When the piece ended, Dex thanked André not just for the music, but for something deeper. He said in recent months his family had forgotten how to experience moments of beauty amid all the medical procedures and worries. This brief concert had reminded them there was more to life than just surviving. André felt those words as validation of something he had always believed, but rarely heard so directly. Music wasn't just entertainment or art. It was a way of being, a way to say what words couldn't. But then came one final twist. Kieran woke up, and with a clarity that seemed to come from his sleep, said something André would never forget. He said he now understood that Jesus wasn't something you knew, like knowing a person, but something you felt in moments like this, when someone gave their gift without expecting anything back. That observation from a child who had just awakened summarized everything André had tried to say the day before, but couldn't articulate. It wasn't about doctrines or creeds. It was about actions, about presence, about choosing to be there for another in vulnerability. André nodded, unable to find words that could add to what Kieran had just said. He packed his violin, hugged each family member, and left the room knowing he hadn't just given but also received, that he had come to comfort, but left comforted by their courage and clarity. In the hallway, he paused and looked back at the closed door. He knew he would probably never know what happened to this family, whether Kieran would recover or Dex would improve. But he also knew that wasn't the point. The point was that for a brief time they had shared something transcendent, something that went beyond illness and health, beyond life and death. The weeks following the hospital visit passed in a strange rhythm for André. Outwardly, everything was the same concerts, same travels, same obligations. But inwardly there was a shift happening that he didn't yet fully understand. Kieran's question stayed with him, not as a burden, but as a compass pointing him in a new direction. He noticed he began playing differently during concerts. Not technically different, audiences probably noticed no change, but for himself there was a different intention. He no longer played just to entertain or achieve perfect execution. He played with awareness that in every audience sat people carrying their own version of Kieran's question, their own search for meaning and connection. In a concert in Los Angeles a few weeks later, André stopped mid-piece. The orchestra looked up, surprised. The audience murmured uncertainly. André set down his violin and spoke directly to the audience in a way he never had before. He told them, without giving details, about a recent hospital visit and a child's question that had moved him. He said he had spent his whole life thinking music gave answers, but now understood music actually asked questions, better questions that helped people find their own answers. The hall was silent. People leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't part of the planned program. This was something else, something real. André picked up his violin again and played the song he had performed for Kieran's family, the simple melody his mother had taught him. He introduced it by saying it wasn't a famous piece, but reminded him of what was truly important: connection, presence, willingness to be vulnerable. As he played, André saw something remarkable happen in the hall. People began crying, not from sadness, but from recognition. He saw elderly people holding each other's hands, young people closing their eyes and seeming to find something within themselves, families moving closer together. The music was doing what words couldn't, creating a shared space of humanity. After the concert, different people approached him. Normally they asked for photos or autographs. This evening, they shared stories. A woman told about her daughter in a hospital. A man spoke about his own struggle with faith. A teenager thanked him for showing that asking questions was okay, that you didn't need all the answers. André listened to each story with attention he hadn't always given his audience. He realized Kieran's question wasn't just about him and that boy. It was universal, one everyone tried to answer in their own way. In the months that followed, André integrated this new approach into all his work. He began each concert with a moment of silence, asking the audience to think about their own questions, their own search. Some critics found it strange, too personal, but many people in the audience responded with deep appreciation. He also spent more time on hospital visits, not as publicity stunts, but as private moments of connection. He played for children and adults, patients and staff, always with the same intention: to be present, truly present, without agenda or expectation. One day, months after his first visit, André received a letter. It was from Sage, Kieran's mother. She wrote that Kieran often spoke about the visit, the music and the conversations. She didn't mention his medical condition, but told how that day had given him something no medicine could provide: a feeling that he was heard, that his questions mattered. The letter ended with a simple sentence André hung on his bulletin board in his study. "Thank you for treating our son like someone with wisdom to share, not just someone who needed to be comforted." That sentence encapsulated what André had learned: that children, the sick, ordinary people, weren't just passive recipients of comfort or entertainment. They were teachers, philosophers, guides who could help others understand life's important questions. André began writing about these experiences, not for publication but for himself, to capture the lessons he was learning. He wrote about how a simple question had shifted his entire perspective, how a child had taught him that knowing wasn't the same as understanding, that presence was more important than answers. He thought back to that moment in the hospital room when Kieran asked if he knew Jesus. He now realized the question wasn't whether he had the right theological answers. The question was whether he lived in a way that reflected what that name meant: love, sacrifice, presence with those who suffered. André understood he was still answering that question every day with every choice he made. Sometimes he failed, played on autopilot, missed chances to truly connect with people. But increasingly often, he returned to that lesson from the hospital room, to the memory of Kieran's clear eyes and direct question. He began encouraging other musicians to see music not just as a career, but as a calling to service. He spoke at conservatories and music schools, telling young musicians that technical skill was important, but the ability to be present with people, to recognize and honor their humanity, was even more important. Some understood immediately what he meant. Others looked confused, still too focused on their own ambition. André didn't judge. He remembered he too had lived for years before truly understanding what his music could mean for others. In his private life, André also became gentler, more patient. He took more time for friends and family, listened more than he spoke, asked questions instead of always giving answers. People around him noticed the change. Some positively, others found it unsettling. Why was the always confident André Rieu suddenly so attentive, so hesitant, so willing to say, "I don't know"? For André, it was simple. He had learned that strength didn't come from having all the answers, but from the courage to take questions seriously, from himself and from others. He had learned that knowing Jesus, or whatever name you gave to the sacred or transcendent, wasn't an intellectual fact but a daily practice of love and presence. André also began reaching out to other hospitals across the country, not with fanfare or media attention, but quietly, personally. He played in pediatric wards in Chicago, cancer centers in New York, rehabilitation facilities in Denver. Each visit taught him something new about resilience, about hope in the face of uncertainty, about the profound questions people asked when confronted with mortality. He collected these stories not as anecdotes for interviews, but as sacred trusts, reminders of his responsibility as someone gifted with a platform and a voice. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were days when the weight of others' pain felt overwhelming, when he wondered if his small gestures made any real difference. During those moments, he would return to his violin, not to perform, but simply to connect with something larger than himself. He would play quietly in his hotel room or at home, not for any audience, but for the mystery he couldn't fully understand, but had learned to respect. In those private moments, he often thought of Kieran, wondering how the boy was doing, hoping he had found peace regardless of what the future held. One evening, nearly 2 years after that first hospital visit, André sat alone in his study in Austria. He picked up his violin and played softly for no one but himself, and perhaps for the unknown forces that worked through him, through music, through the connections he made with other people. He thought about Kieran and realized something profound. The boy's question about knowing Jesus had led him to understand that faith, in whatever form it took, was fundamentally about relationship, not just with the divine, but with each other, with the suffering world around them. As he played, André felt something he couldn't name but recognized. It was the same feeling he'd had in that hospital room, the sensation that he wasn't alone, that there was something greater working through him, through the music, through the connections he made with people. He stopped playing and sat in the silence of his study, surrounded by photographs from concerts around the world, awards and accolades that suddenly seemed less important than a single letter from a mother thanking him for seeing her sick child's wisdom. In that silence, he heard no voices or revelations, but he felt a deep peace, an acceptance that some questions would never be fully answered, and that was okay. The searching itself, the continued asking, the willingness to be open to new insights, that was the answer. André understood now that his entire life had become an exercise in that giving Kieran had described, offering presence, attention, music, whatever gift he had, without expecting anything in return. The boy had taught him that the sacred wasn't found in grand gestures or perfect answers, but in small moments of authentic connection between human beings. He stood, carefully placed his violin in its case, and looked out the window at the night sky above the Austrian countryside. Tomorrow there would be another concert, another opportunity to put these lessons into practice. And somewhere, perhaps in a hospital or at home, there was a young man named Kieran, who had taught a world-famous musician that the most important questions in life often come from the most unexpected places, and that answering them could change us in ways we never could have predicted. André smiled softly, grateful beyond words for a 14-year-old's courage to ask what others were afraid to ask, and for the chance to be part of a moment that transcended music, fame, and all the things he once thought mattered most.